Guys, tonight, listen up. We're going to start all together, and then we're going to split into groups, and that'll just kind of be the flow for tonight. And so I want to say again, thank you guys for hanging with us each week. And as we get through of all the lessons this semester, and as we kind of work from the beginning of the Bible all the way to the end, tonight is actually the night where we cover the largest section that we're going to cover all semester. So we're really like finishing off the Old Testament here tonight. And we're going to talk through really this part of the diagram. We mentioned last week we kind of ended in Canaan with the people kind of fusing and taking on all the practices of the people around them. We're going to go up this all the way to Solomon, and we're going to go all the way down to Babylon tonight. So we're going to take this kind of triangle here, and that's really the majority of the Old Testament. And so if you got the Bible in front of you, if you would just open up to the book of 1 Samuel. Just want to show you kind of the chunk that we're looking at tonight. So we ended last week, we said that probably about 6 or 7 chapters of 1 Samuel are included in that era of the judges. So go ahead and just put your one finger in there at 1 Samuel. And then if you would just flip, and look at all the stuff that you're seeing, flip, all the way over to the New Testament or the book of Matthew. I just want to give you some scope here of how much you're covering. So if you keep going, probably, I lost mine there. There we go. Maybe your book, Bible, has one like mine where it's like, the New Testament. Thank you for labeling that so clearly. And then kind of put your fingers in from the top and look down at it. Someone told me this one time. They're like, if you've ever wondered like how you're reading your Bible and stuff, like sometimes it's helpful just to kind of piece it out like this and look at it. So that section in between your fingers, that's the triangle we're talking about tonight. All the different stuff that have to do with the kings and the prophets and really the nation of Israel. What you're holding in between those fingers is really the history of a nation. From its conception, really in its first king, all the way through its destruction or its exile and the return. And so what you're looking at really is like a third of your whole Bible. And again, I tell you all that because there are so many characters, so many people, so many stories, so many ups and downs and ins and outs of that story. We can't cover all of it tonight, but I just wanted to give you a feel because when you're talking about the Old Testament, in large part, you're talking about the history of the nation of Israel. You're talking about this people that came out of Egypt and entered into this land. They established themselves in the land. And then as they started to kind of look like the rest of the people of the land, they made a request. They said, we want to have a king. And we want a king like everybody else has a king. And so they selected a king. And Samuel, the prophet, the judge, he anoints this king named Saul. A lot of you guys know the story of Saul. Saul turns out to not be that great of a king. And so Samuel anoints another king, a guy named David. And David really is kind of like Abraham and like Moses. He's one of the central figures of the Old Testament. And David has a son named Solomon. And really, once Solomon completes the temple in Jerusalem, now you have a nation with a king and a city and a place of worship. It's really kind of the high point of Israel's history. In fact, the story says that the presence of God came and filled the temple. And people from all these other countries, they started to come to Solomon. They started to come to Jerusalem for wisdom. They wanted to hear about the blessings of God. And so when we see the temple period and this kind of era of Solomon, this is kind of the high point of Israel's history. And it's really the closest they come to fulfilling their role in the covenant. All the people of the earth are coming into Jerusalem and they're coming to Solomon, and Solomon's distributing the blessings of God and the favor of God and the wisdom of God over all of these peoples from all these different places. But then Solomon takes a turn, and really the rest of that story is a decline. And the kingdom is split into 2 kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The kingdom of Israel is constantly ruled by wicked kings who are far from God and keep pushing further and further from God. The southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, has a couple of good kings that come in at different points and some different stuff that happens where it looks like they might restore the blessing. But ultimately, there's an ancient empire, the empire of Babylon, that comes and destroys the city of Jerusalem. They destroy the temple that Solomon has built. They take all the riches of Israel and they distribute it throughout their kingdom. They take all the people out of the land except for a righteous or a few people, a remnant left in the land. This is really the era then that you start hearing stories about people like Daniel. Is one of the more popular ones about Daniel. This is where you hear this, you get the story of Esther out of this era. We have Uno, buddy. You're right. Hold on. You get the story of Esther, but really what you're longing for and what you start to see is this desire to return to Jerusalem, this desire to rebuild the temple, this desire to go back to the homeland. And that's really the entire story of the people of God. They're longing for a home. They're longing to be in the place where God's presence is most rich. They're longing to be in that place of blessing, and they're often struggling to get there. This is how, at the end of 2 Chronicles, this is how the exile to Babylon is recorded. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 17 says that God brought up against the Israelites the king of the Chaldeans, or the king of Babylon, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary and had no compassion on young men or virgin or old man or age. He gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the kings and his princes, all of these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. They took into exile into Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the king of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill the 70 years. Why do I tell you that whole history? Like, sometimes we go through these Bible things. It's like, yeah. So what? Well, if you're wondering how these kind of there are three storylines that weave together, kind of like a braid, throughout this Old Testament. There's a story of kings, there's a story of prophets, and there are the stories of priests. And what you see kind of woven together throughout that history are these three offices of leadership: kings, prophets, and priests. And what you find over and over and over again repeated is that the entire nation of Israel tends to go in the direction of its leaders. If they have a good king, good things happen. If they have a bad king, bad things happen. If they have good priests, good things happen. If they have bad priests, bad things happen. If they have good prophets, good things happen. If they have bad prophets, bad things happen. The leadership really drives the history. And it got me thinking, when we think about, well, what about us? What does this really matter? Well, one, this is what sets the entire stage for Jesus coming into the picture. And what we find in the New Testament is that Jesus is the greatest king, the greatest priest, and the greatest prophet. So all three of those offices fuse in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the highest priest, he is the most noble king, and he is the most righteous prophet. He fulfills all three offices in and of himself. But before that, it just got me thinking about, how easily influenced we are by our leaders. Like the people in charge tend to set the pace. And if there's one thing that's true of the entire kind of history of Israel, it's an interesting sociological study in like herd mentality. Like wherever the leaders go, the people follow. Wherever the leaders go, the people follow. And when there's good kings, then good things happen. Where there are bad kings, bad things happen. And so tonight I thought it'd be worthwhile just to spend some time thinking about who we allow to lead us. Now, we have a much different context being in 21st century America, a democratic country. We have a much different kind of makeup. We're not under the authoritarian rule of kings and priests and prophets, but there are kingly offices in our day and age. There are people who are in charge of running government and keeping things in line locally and nationally. What happens when we have good leaders in those offices? Do good things follow? Priestly duties and responsibilities when it comes to religious institutions, like when we have good leaders in those places, isn't it true that good things tend to follow? When we have bad leaders in those positions, isn't it true that bad things tend to follow? The same for prophets, the contemplatives, the people who hear things on behalf of God and speak on behalf of God, the prophetic voices in our day. Like, are there good prophets and are there bad prophets? And tonight, I just want you to think about that. Who's leading you? Whose voices are most influencing the trajectories of your lives? Are they good voices and good influences, or are they negative voices and negative influences? Because when the leadership is good, it tends to follow that good things come. When the leadership is poor, it tends to follow that negative outcomes abound. And so as you think tonight, prophets, priests, and kings, and what do we have in common with all of these Old Testament stories? I want you to think about the leaders who are shaping your life. And it may be a good time just to call into question, like, man, should I be following those people or not? Should I call into question some of the decisions and things that they're making or not? And ultimately, let's remember that Jesus is the supreme prophet, the highest king, the greatest priest. He is the fulfillment of all three of those offices. And that's why we choose to follow him. If you're wondering, how do I know if someone's a good leader? Well, Matthew 7, when Jesus was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7 says that you'll know that they're good trees by the fruit they bear. You'll be able to look at the fruit of their lives and recognize whether or not they're worthy of imitation, worthy of following. And so tonight, let's just spend a little bit of time in our groups evaluating the leadership in our lives and looking to see if they're good trees with good fruit or if they're bad trees with bad fruit. And then ultimately, let's talk about what it looks like to follow Jesus as the highest king, the greatest prophet, and the most noble priest. So thank you guys for putting up with Warren over there. That's quite the distraction that I brought him, but I'm very impressed by you guys tonight. So gentlemen, you guys can pop over there, and then ladies, you can come up here where Warren's bouncing around.